You're gonna get us all killed, sweetheart! Corporal Jake Reynolds roared, ripping the rifle case from Emily Carter's hands and hurling it across the barracks until her custom weapon slammed into the wall. He shoved her back hard, jabbing a finger in her face while men scrambled out of the way. Command handed my life to some woman playing soldier, and I am not dying for it. He spat at her boots and stormed out. 72 hours later, on a ridge in the Mojave, that same woman would drop 5 armed enemy fighters in the time it took Reynolds to chamber a single round he never even fired. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something. If you believe respect should be earned by what a person does and not by how they look, then take 1 second right now and subscribe to this channel. Follow this story all the way to the end because it changes in ways you will not see coming. And leave a comment telling me the city where you're watching from so I can see just how far Emily Carter's story has traveled. Now let's begin. The briefing room at Camp Pendleton smelled like old coffee and colder attitudes. Sergeant Marcus Hayes stood at the front with a folder in his hand and a look on his face that his men had learned to read over the years. It was the look he wore when he was about to say something they wouldn't like. "Listen up," Hayes said. "We've got a new Overwatch specialist joining Delta Recon for the upcoming operation, effective immediately." Corporal Reynolds leaned back in his chair with a grin already forming. "About time. We could use another shooter who actually knows the ground." Hayes didn't smile. "Her name is Chief Petty Officer Emily Carter, Navy. She's a sniper attached to us temporarily by command for the Mojave reconnaissance mission." The word landed like a stone dropped into a still pond. Reynolds said. "You heard me right?" For a moment, nobody spoke. Then somebody in the back let out a low whistle, and somebody else chuckled, and the whole room seemed to tilt into a kind of quiet, ugly amusement that didn't need words to be understood. Reynolds shook his head slowly like a man who'd just been told the sun rose in the west. "Sergeant, with all due respect, we are going into hostile terrain. We are going to be sitting on a ridge with our lives depending on the person watching over us. And command wants that person to be some Navy girl who's probably spent her whole career behind a spotting scope on a training range." "That's the order," Hayes said. "Orders can be wrong." The room went very still because that was a line most men didn't cross out loud. But Reynolds had said it, and now it hung there in the air, and every man in the room was waiting to see what Hayes would do with it. Hayes set the folder down on the table. He was quiet for a long moment. "You've been running your mouth since I walked in here, Corporal. So let me ask you something. How many confirmed engagements do you have at 800 meters or beyond?" Reynolds hesitated. "That's not the point." "How many, Corporal?" "A few." "A few," Hayes repeated. "Carter has more than any man in this room, in conditions worse than anything you've trained in, but you keep telling me the order's wrong." That shut Reynolds up, but only for a second. He wasn't the kind of man who backed down when he was embarrassed. He was the kind of man who got louder. "Numbers on a page," he muttered. "I'll believe it when I see it." "You'll see it," Hayes said. "Trust me on that." There was a young private near the door named Danny Cortez, barely 22 years old, still soft around the edges of who he was going to become. He raised his hand halfway the way a kid raises his hand in a classroom when he's not sure he's allowed to speak. "Sergeant, is it true she volunteered for this? For our unit specifically?" "She didn't volunteer," Hayes said. Command picked on her because she's the best they had available and because this mission needs the best." Reynolds snorted. "The best they had available. That's a nice way of saying nobody else wanted the job." A few men laughed, not all of them, but enough. Hayes let the laughter die on its own, and when it did, the silence it left behind was worse than the noise. "You're going to want to be careful, Corporal," he said quietly, "because there's going to come a day maybe sooner than you think when you'll wish you'd shown a little more respect to the person holding your life in her hands." "When that day comes," Reynolds said, "I'll apologize. Until then, I'll say what I think." "That's the problem, Sam," Hayes said. "You say a lot of what you think, not much of it's worth hearing." The men went, "Ooh," the way men do, and even Reynolds cracked a bitter half smile, but the smile didn't reach his eyes because he knew he'd been put in his place, and he didn't like it one bit. Outside, the desert wind was already picking up. It came off the training grounds in long, dry gusts that carried the fine grit of the California high desert into every crack and seam of the base. And somewhere out beyond the gate, a plain government sedan was rolling toward them, carrying a woman who had spent her entire adult life being underestimated by rooms exactly like this one. Emily Carter had heard it all before. She had heard it as a boot in her first duty station. She had heard it from instructors who assumed she'd wash out. She had heard it from men twice her size who couldn't understand how someone who moved so quietly could hit targets they couldn't even find. She had learned a long time ago that arguing was a waste of breath. Words changed nothing. Only the shot changed things. Only the result. She stepped out of the sedan with a duffel over one shoulder and a hard rifle case in her hand. She was 29 years old, average height, with the kind of calm face that gave away nothing. She didn't walk fast. She didn't walk slow. She walked like someone who had spent years in places where every movement had a cost and had learned to make every one of them count. The Marines saw her coming across the yard. Word had traveled fast, the way it always does on a base, and by the time she reached the barracks, a small crowd had gathered under the pretense of doing nothing in particular. Reynolds was among them. He looked her up and down, slow and deliberate, making sure she saw him do it. "That's her," he said, loud enough to carry. "That's the sniper who's going to save us all." Emily didn't slow down. She didn't speed up. She didn't look at him. That more than anything seemed to bother him. "Hey," he called out. "Chief, you lost. The office is back that way." A few men laughed. Emily stopped. She turned her head slowly and looked at Reynolds for the first time, and she smiled. Not a warm smile, not an angry one either. A small, patient smile, the smile of someone who has met 100 men just like him and outlasted every single one. "You must be Reynolds," she said. He blinked, thrown off. "How'd you know that?" "Because there's always one," she said, and she picked her case back up and kept walking. The men howled, not at her this time, at him, and Reynolds stood there red-faced, realizing he'd just been handed a loss in front of his whole team by a woman he'd sworn wasn't worth taking seriously. That was the first crack. He didn't see it yet, but it was there. Sergeant Hayes met her at the door. He didn't smile, but he didn't sneer either. He was one of the few men on that base who had learned the hard way that the battlefield doesn't care about anybody's opinion. He'd buried men who talked big, and he'd been saved by people nobody expected. He'd learned to keep his mouth shut and watch. "Chief Carter," he said, offering his hand. "Sergeant Hayes." She shook it. Her grip was firm, but there was nothing to prove in it. "You'll have to forgive the welcome," Hayes said. "My men are a little set in their ways." "I've noticed," Emily said. "It's fine." "Is it?" She considered the question. "It doesn't matter if it's fine, Sergeant. It matters if it slows down the mission. And it won't." Hayes studied her for a moment. He'd been reading people his whole career, and something about the flat certainty in her voice told him this woman had walked into far worse rooms than this one and walked back out. "Come on," he said. "I'll show you where you're bunking." Inside the barracks, the tension followed them like a bad smell. The Marines watched her set her gear down on an empty bunk in the corner. They watched her open her rifle case, not to show off, but simply to inspect her weapon, the way any professional would after a long transport. And when the lid came up, a few of them fell quiet despite themselves. Inside was a precision rifle, custom-built, meticulously maintained, modified for extreme distance work. Every surface of it spoke of thousands of hours of care. The men who knew weapons, and most of them did, could read a rifle the way a farmer reads soil. This one told a story. It told them that whatever they thought about the woman who owned it, she took her craft more seriously than any of them. Private Cortez drifted over, drawn like a kid to a fire. "That's a nice setup, Chief," he said quietly. Emily glanced at him. There was something in his face that was different from the others. Curiosity instead of contempt. "You shoot?" she asked. "A little. I mean, I qualified, but not like," he gestured at the rifle. "Not like that." "Nobody starts like that," Emily said. "You start by missing. A lot. Then you figure out why you missed. That's the whole job, really. Figuring out why you missed so you don't do it again." Cortez nodded slowly, like she'd told him something important. Maybe she had. From across the room, Reynolds watched the exchange with narrowed eyes. He didn't like it. He didn't like the way the kid was looking at her. He didn't like the quiet respect creeping into the room like a draft under a door. "Don't let her fill your head, Cortez," he called out. "Pretty rifle doesn't mean pretty numbers. Anybody can polish a gun. Not everybody can pull the trigger when it counts." Emily didn't rise to it. She just kept cleaning her weapon, calm as still water. But Cortez, to his own surprise, spoke up. She's got more confirmed engagements than the whole team, Corporal. Sergeant said so. The room went quiet again. Reynolds crossed the floor slowly, and there was something dangerous in the way he moved now, the way a man moves when his pride's been stepped on one too many times. He stopped in front of Emily's bunk and looked down at her. "Let me tell you how this works out here, Chief," he said. "You can have all the paperwork in the world, but out on that ridge, when it's 110 degrees and you've been laying in your own sweat for 6 hours in the shots 800 meters into a crosswind, you can't read. None of that paper's going to matter. You'll choke. And when you choke, one of us pays for it. Maybe all of us." Emily set down her cleaning cloth. She looked up at him, and for the first time there was something in her eyes beyond patience. Not anger. Something colder and steadier than anger. "You're worried I'll choke," she said. "I'm worried you'll get us killed." "You want to know what I'm worried about, Corporal?" She stood up slow so that they were nearly eye to eye. "I'm worried that you're so busy watching me that you're not watching the ground. I'm worried that when the moment comes, and it always comes faster than anybody expects, you'll be looking for a reason to blame me instead of doing your job. I'm worried about the man who talks the most because, in my experience, he's usually the one who freezes when it gets loud." The room was dead silent now. Every eye was on the two of them. Reynolds' jaw tightened. "You don't know a thing about me." "No," Emily agreed, "but I've met you before, 100 times, and you always sound exactly the same." She sat back down and picked up her cloth. "Now, if you don't mind, I've got work to do. Some of us like to be ready." For a moment, it looked like Reynolds might do something stupid. His fists were clenched at his sides, but Hayes's voice cut across the room like a whip. "Reynolds, outside, now." Reynolds stood there another second, chest heaving, then turned and stalked out the door. The men let out a breath they hadn't realized they were holding. Cortez looked at Emily with something close to awe. "How'd you know he'd back down?" "I didn't," Emily said, "but men like that need an audience. Take away the applause and they run out of steam." She went back to cleaning her rifle. But her hands, if anyone had been watching closely, weren't quite as steady as her voice. Because the truth was she was tired. Tired in a way that went deeper than the flight, deeper than the desert heat. Tired of walking into rooms and having to win the same fight over and over, one hostile stranger at a time. Tired of proving again and again that she deserved to be somewhere she'd already earned the right to be. She never let it show. She'd learned that lesson young, but it was there. Outside, Hayes found Reynolds pacing by the vehicles, kicking at the gravel like a bull that couldn't find anything to charge. "You want to tell me what that was?" Hayes said. "She started it." "She started it," Hayes repeated flatly. "You're a grown man, Corporal, a Marine, and you're telling me a Navy chief you met 20 minutes ago got so far under your skin that you almost swung on her in the barracks in front of the whole team?" Reynolds didn't answer. "Here's what I know," Hayes went on. "I know you're a good rifleman. I know you're steady when the shooting starts. I've seen it, but I also know you've got a hole in you the size of a truck, and that hole is your pride. And pride gets men killed faster than bullets do." He stepped closer. "You don't have to like her. You don't have to trust her. But you will do your job, and you will let her do hers. Because in about 36 hours, we are going to be sitting on a ridge in the Mojave with our necks stuck out, and the only thing standing between this team and a body bag might just be that woman you can't stop insulting. Are we clear?" Reynolds stared at the ground. "We're clear." "Say it like you mean it." "We're clear, Sergeant." Hayes nodded and started to walk away. Then he stopped and turned back. "One more thing. You said orders can be wrong. You're right. Sometimes they are. But this one isn't. And someday you're going to be real grateful for that. I just hope it's not on the day it cost you to learn it." He left Reynolds standing alone in the wind. That evening, as the sun bled out over the western hills, the team gathered for the mission briefing. Hayes laid it out on a map spread across the table. The operation was straightforward on paper. Delta Recon would move 8 miles on foot through rough desert terrain to an abandoned communication station overlooking a valley. Below that valley ran a supply route that intelligence believed enemy forces were using. A friendly convoy would pass through the following morning. Delta's job was simple: observe, report, protect. "Overwatch is Carter," Hayes said. "She sets up at the station and covers the valley. The rest of us provide security and secondary observation. Nobody engages unless Carter or I give the word." Questions? There were none. but the men's eyes kept drifting to Emily, sitting quietly at the edge of the table, studying the map with an intensity that seemed to shut out the rest of the room. "You've got something to add, Chief?" Hayes asked. Emily looked up. "The station overlooks the valley from the north. That's good for the convoy, but it also means anyone who wants to hit that convoy is going to set up on the south ridge here." She put her finger on the map. "Good cover, elevated, long sight lines down the road. If I were going to ambush that convoy, that's exactly where I'd do it." Reynolds couldn't help himself. "So now you're an ambush expert too." "I'm a sniper," Emily said without looking at him. "My whole job is understanding how the other guy thinks, where he hides, when he shoots, what he's afraid of. You can't do this work if you only think like yourself." She turned to Hayes. "I'm just saying we should assume that ridge is occupied until we know it isn't. It costs us nothing to be careful. It could cost us everything not to be." Hayes looked at the map for a long moment. Then he nodded. "Noted. We treat the South Ridge as hostile until proven otherwise." "Good call, Chief." It was a small thing, a tactical note, but something shifted in the room when Hayes said good call. Because as sergeant, they all respected the man whose judgment they'd bet their lives on more than once, had just publicly agreed with the woman half of them had spent the day mocking. And a few of the men quietly began to wonder if maybe they'd been too quick to judge. Not Reynolds. Reynolds sat there stewing, but even he, in some corner of his mind, he'd never admit to filed away what she'd said. Because it was smart. And he knew it was smart. And that made it worse. The briefing broke up and the men drifted back to their bunks to prep their gear. Cortez lingered near Emily as she rolled and repacked her kit with the efficiency of someone who'd done it 10,000 times. "Can I ask you something, Chief?" he said. "You can ask. Why'd you take the assignment, I mean? You had to know how it'd go. Coming into a Marine recon unit? As a Navy chief, he stopped himself. "As a woman," Emily finished for him. "You can say it. It's not a bad word." Cortez flushed. "I just mean, you had to know they'd give you a hard time." Emily was quiet for a moment, her hands still moving over her gear. "You want to know the truth? I stopped asking myself that question a long time ago. Why me? Why here? Whether it's fair. It's not about fair. It's about the job. There's a convoy of people rolling through that valley tomorrow morning who have families waiting on them. Sons, daughters, somebody's whole world in every truck. And if there's a machine gun team on that South Ridge waiting to turn those trucks into a graveyard, then the only thing that matters is whether I'm good enough to stop it. Not whether the men in that room like me. Not whether it's fair that I have to prove myself twice as hard for half the credit. Just whether I can do the job." She snapped her kit closed. "And I can, so I took it." Cortez didn't say anything for a while. Then quietly, "That's the realest thing anybody said to me since I joined up." Emily gave him a small smile. "Get some sleep, Cortez. Tomorrow's going to be a long day." But sleep didn't come easy for anyone that night. The desert cooled fast once the sun was down, and the wind moaned through the gaps in the barracks like something restless and hungry. Emily lay on her bunk in the dark, listening to the breathing of a dozen men who didn't want her there, and she thought about all the ridges she'd lain on, and all the shots she'd made, and all the faces of the men whose lives had turned on whether she got it right. She didn't feel fear exactly. She'd made peace with fear years ago. What she felt was the weight, the particular private weight of being the person everyone was counting on, whether they admitted it or not. Across the room, Reynolds lay awake too. He'd never tell a soul, but her words in the barracks had gotten into him and wouldn't leave. The man who talks the most is usually the one who freezes when it gets loud. He told himself she was wrong. He told himself she didn't know him. But somewhere underneath the anger, a small, cold voice asked a question he didn't want to answer. What if she's right? What if when it gets loud, I'm the one who chokes? He rolled over and shut his eyes and tried to make the voice go away. Morning came gray and early. The team assembled in the dark before dawn, faces painted weapons, check packs heavy with water and ammunition, and the thousand small things that keep men alive in hostile country. Hayes gave the final brief in a low voice, and then they moved out through the wire and into the desert, a line of shadows walking into the coming light. The 8-mile approach was brutal. The terrain climbed and broke and climbed again, loose rock underfoot, steep grades that burned the legs and lungs. The men carried heavy loads, and they pushed the pace, and though nobody said it out loud, they pushed it harder than they had to, because there was an unspoken test happening on that trail and every man knew it. They were waiting for Emily to fall behind, to slow them down, to prove them right. She didn't. She moved through that terrain like she'd been born to it. While the Marines fought the mountains, she seemed to flow around it, reading the ground, choosing her footing, conserving her strength in a way that spoke of long, hard experience. She didn't complain. She didn't ask for a break. She didn't fall back. Hour after hour, mile after mile, she was simply there, steady and quiet, matching a pace the men had set specifically to break her. By the time they neared the observation point, the sun was well up and the heat was climbing fast, and several of the Marines were gone down, sweat-soaked, breathing hard legs shaking from the grind. And Emily Carter, who they'd been so sure would be the weak link, looked like she could turn around and do it all again. Reynolds saw it. He didn't want to, but he saw it. And for the first time, the certainty that had carried him through the last 24 hours began to feel less like a wall and more like a fence he wasn't sure would hold. At the abandoned station, Emily didn't stop to catch her breath. She didn't drink or sit or wait for someone to tell her what to do. She found her position a spot on the north side with a commanding view of the valley below, and she went to work. Rifle out, bipod down, range card out. She began building her hide with the quiet, methodical focus of a craftsman, setting up a workshop, mapping distances, noting landmarks, reading the wind, all of it, while the Marines were still recovering from the climb. Cortez, watching her, leaned over to the man next to him and murmured, "She hasn't even sat down." "Yeah," the other man said. "I noticed." Hayes noticed too. He noticed everything. And as he watched Emily disappear into her work, becoming so still and so focused that she seemed to fade into the very ground she lay on, he allowed himself a small, private nod of satisfaction, because he'd bet on her. And bets like that were how you stayed alive out here. You learned to read people fast and true, and you bet on the ones who were the real thing. Emily Carter was the real thing. He'd known it the moment she shook his hand. Now he just had to hope the rest of his men would figure it out before it was too late. The hours crawled by, the sun climbed higher, and the heat pressed down like a hand. The valley below shimmered in the rising air, empty and quiet, a long ribbon of road winding through the broken country. The convoy wasn't due for a while yet, and the waiting settled over the team like a heavy blanket. The Marines grew restless the way men do when nothing is happening and everything might. They shifted. They drank water. They muttered to each other. They complained quietly about the heat and the boredom and the long crawl of a morning with no end in sight. But Emily didn't move. She lay behind her rifle, utterly still, so motionless that a stranger might have thought her asleep. But she wasn't asleep. She was more awake than any of them. Because to Emily, this was the real work, not the shot. The shot was easy in a way. The shot was the reward at the end of the hard part. The hard part was this: the waiting, the stillness, the endless patient reading of the ground, watching for the one thing that didn't belong, the single detail out of a million that would mean the difference between everyone going home and no one going home at all. She scanned the South Ridge again and again and again. The ridge she'd flagged the night before, the ridge that she was almost certain exactly where a smart enemy would set up. She looked at it inch by inch, rock by rock, the way you'd search a familiar face for a lie. And then in the middle of that endless, sun-hammered stillness, Emily Carter saw something. It was nothing, less than nothing, a shadow that sat a fraction wrong, a patch of desert that didn't quite match the desert around it. A shape that the eye would slide right over unless it had spent 10,000 hours learning exactly what to look for. She went very, very still, stiller than still. "Sergeant," she said, and her voice was so low and calm that at first Hayes almost didn't register the words. "Stop scanning the road." The men nearby froze. "Say again," Hayes murmured. "Everybody stop looking at the road," Emily said, still not moving, her eye welded to her scope. "Look at the ridge, the South Ridge. Center mass just below the two rocks that lean together. Tell me what you see." Marines lifted their optics. They scanned where she'd told them, and for a long moment they saw nothing but rock and shadow and the shimmer of desert heat. "I don't see anything," someone whispered. "Keep looking," Emily said. "Be patient. Let it come to you." And then Cortez sucked in a sharp breath. "Oh my God," because it was there. Once you saw it, you couldn't unsee it. A man, then another, camouflaged, dug in, holding perfectly still. waiting exactly where Emily had said they'd be, exactly where she'd warned them to look the night before when half the team had been too busy laughing to listen. "I count two," Hayes breathed. "There's more," Emily said quietly. "There's always more. Give me a minute." And she gave the ridge that minute, that terrible patient minute, and one by one the enemy revealed themselves to her trained and unforgiving eye, not because they moved, they were too disciplined to move, but because she knew how to read the ground they were hiding in, and the ground told her everything. "Five," she said at the last. "There are five of them." "Five," Hayes repeated grimly. "A machine gun team dug in on the left. That's the anchor. That's the killer if the convoy comes through." Her voice was flat, clinical, utterly without fear. "One man with a launcher center, rockets. He's there for the vehicles. Two more spread wide, elevated. Marksmen. They'll pick off anybody who dismounts and tries to fight back. And one in the rear, higher up, watching everything." She paused. "That's the spotter. That's the brain. He's the one calling the whole thing." The silence on that ridge was absolute. Every man on the team understood all at once exactly what they were looking at. It was a kill box, a perfectly built, patiently laid ambush, and in a matter of minutes, a convoy full of American service members was going to drive straight into the mouth of it, never knowing until the first burst of machine gun fire tore through the lead vehicle and turned a routine supply run into a massacre. And there was no time to move, no time to reposition, no time for anything except the terrible arithmetic of the moment. Reynolds looked through his scope at the 5 hidden killers on that ridge, and then he looked at the ribbon of empty road where the convoy would appear. And then slowly he turned his head and looked at Emily Carter. The woman he'd mocked, the woman he'd sworn would get them all killed, the woman who had just seen with her own quiet, patient eyes the death trap that not one of the seasoned Marines around her had spotted. And in that moment, everything he thought he knew about strength, about who belonged and who didn't, about what a warrior was supposed to look like, began to come apart in his hands. Because the only person on that ridge who could stop what was about to happen, the only one with the skill and the position and the nerve to break that ambush before it started, was the one he'd been so sure didn't deserve to be there at all. Hayes was already reaching for the radio. "This is Delta Recon. We have eyes on a 5-man enemy ambush element on the south ridge above the convoy route requesting immediate air support, over." He listened, his jaw tightened. He said it again, harder. And then he lowered the radio slowly, and the look on his face told the whole team the answer before he said a word. "Air's too far out," he said. "They can't get here in time." The words dropped into the silence like stones into a grave. Somewhere down the valley, faint and growing, came the low mechanical rumble of engines. The convoy was coming. Right on schedule, rolling steady and unsuspecting toward the exact patch of road where 5 patient men were waiting to kill them. The Marines looked at each other. They looked at the ridge. They looked at the road. And every single one of them arrived at the same impossible truth in the same terrible instant. There was no cavalry coming. There was no time to fall back. There was no clever plan. There was only the distance between Emily Carter's rifle and 5 hidden enemies, and the handful of seconds she'd have to close it before the whole valley erupted in fire. Reynolds' mouth had gone dry. All the swagger, all the certainty, all the cruel jokes of the past day were gone, burned away by the plain and brutal reality in front of him. He looked at Emily one more time, and when he spoke, his voice didn't sound like his own. It sounded small, human, afraid. "Millie," he said. And the fact that he used her name, her first name, after a full day of calling her nothing but chief and worse, said more than any apology ever could. "Emily, can you stop them?" Emily Carter didn't answer right away. She was already settling in behind her rifle, her breathing slowing, her whole world narrowing down to the reticle and the wind and the 5 men who didn't yet know they'd been seen. The distance was extreme. The wind was shifting and treacherous. The heat was warping the air into a rippling curtain that could bend a bullet just enough to turn a kill into a miss and a miss into a disaster. Every reason to fail was stacked against her. But she had spent her entire life being told she couldn't, and she had spent every one of those years learning in silence exactly how to prove them wrong. She let out a slow breath. Her finger found the trigger, and in a voice so calm it sent a chill down the spine of every man who heard it, Emily Carter finally answered the question that Corporal Jake Reynolds had been too proud to ask the day before and too frightened not to ask now. "Watch me." The word hung in the air like a struck match, And for one heartbeat, nobody on that ridge dared to breathe. Reynolds stared at her. "Watch me," she'd said. Not a promise, not a boast, just a fact delivered in that same flat, unbothered voice she'd used to tell him, "There's always one." And somewhere down in the valley, the rumble of the convoy engines grew louder, closer, hungrier. And every man on that ridge understood that the next 60 seconds would decide whether a dozen strangers lived or died. "Talk to me, Carter," Hayes said low and hard. "What do you need?" "Quiet," Emily said. "That's all. I need everybody to be quiet, and I need nobody to move." Hayes turned his head a fraction. "You heard the chief? Nobody breathes without permission. Reynolds, you're my second set of eyes. Watch the spotter in the rear. If he twitches, you tell me you don't shoot." "Understood." Reynolds' throat worked. "Understood, Sergeant." He pressed his eye to his scope and found the man in the back. The brain, the one Emily had flagged, and his hands were not as steady as he wanted them to be. He noticed that. He hated that he noticed that. The man who talks the most is usually the one who freezes when it gets loud, her words running through his skull like cold water, and he clamped his jaw and held the crosshair and prayed she was wrong about him. Emily was somewhere else entirely. The world had gone small and clean and slow. There was the rifle, and there was the wind, and there was the ridge, and there was nothing else. Not the heat baking through her clothes, not the 12 pairs of eyes on her back, not the day of insults, or the years of them before it. All of that fell away, and what remained was the oldest and truest thing she knew about herself, that in the moment that mattered when everyone else was drowning in fear, she went still. She read the machine gunner first, left side, dug in behind a low shelf of rock barrel already trained down the road waiting for the kill. He was the anchor. He was the one who would open the ambush, and once he opened it, the convoy was gone. She ranged him, 840 meters. She read the flags of dust drifting off the ridgeline, read the shimmer of the heat, read the crosswind pushing left to right, and the way it would want to carry her bullet just enough to matter. "First engines coming into the open," Cortez whispered, and his voice cracked. "Chief, the lead truck's about to hit the kill zone." "I know," Emily said. "They're going to open up any second." "I know." Her fingers settled on the trigger. And Corporal Reynolds, watching her hands, watching the impossible calm, in a person who by every right should have been terror-rated, felt something shift in his chest that he could not name and did not want to feel. Because it looked for all the world like she had done this 1,000 times. Like she had lain in 100 hides on 100 ridges with 100 lives balanced on the end of her rifle and had walked away from every one of them. The lead vehicle rolled into the open. The machine gunner's shoulder tensed. Emily fired. The shot cracked across the valley like the sky splitting open, and 840 meters away, the machine gunner's head snapped back and he folded over his own weapon and did not move again. He never fired. He never got the chance. The anchor of the entire ambush was gone before he'd squeezed a single round, and the convoy rolled on, oblivious, unharmed. For half a second, nobody on the ridge breathed. "Target down," Emily said, already working the bolt. "Rocket next." "Holy!" someone started, and Hayes hissed him quiet. Down on the far ridge, the ambush came apart in confusion. The other four had heard the shot had felt rather than seen their gunner die, and they were doing the math the same way the Marines were realizing all at once that they were not the hunters anymore. The man with the launcher lurched up onto his knee, swinging the tube toward the road in a panic, ready to salvage the ambush. The only way he had left, by putting a rocket into the convoy before the trucks could scatter. He was fast. Emily was faster. The second shot took him high in the chest and pitched him backward, and the launcher tumbled from his hands and clattered down the rocks. The rocket inside it, never armed, never fired, never anything but a thing that almost happened. 2 down, 11 seconds. The convoy was pulling into a defensive spread now, the drivers finally sensing something was wrong. Gunners on the truck swiveling to find a threat they couldn't see. "That's 2, Hayes breathed. His voice had changed. There was something in it now that hadn't been there a minute ago, something close to awe. "Carter, you've got the spotter breaking. Rear position. He's running." Reynolds saw at the same instant. The brain. The man calling the whole thing. He'd watched 2 of his men die in the space of a breath, and whatever nerve he'd had was gone, and he was scrambling backward up the ridge toward a fold in the rock that would hide him, moving fast, moving smart. A man who knew he was being hunted, and knew exactly how much his life was worth if he stayed still. "He's gonna make the rocks," Reynolds said, and his voice was tight. "Chief, he's gonna make the rocks. He's got maybe 3 seconds." "Two," Emily corrected softly. She didn't rush. That was the thing that undid Reynolds completely, the thing he would think about for the rest of his life. The spotter was running for his life, and Emily Carter did not rush. She tracked him smooth as still water, leading him reading the ground he was running across, and she waited for the exact half instant when his path took him over open rock, and in that half instant, before he could reach the cover that would have saved him, she fired. The spotter dropped mid-stride and slid down the slope and lay still. "Three," Hayes said, and now he wasn't hiding it anymore. "Three down. My God, Carter." Cortez was staring through his optic with his mouth open. She got the spotter. She got the runner. Nobody makes that shot. Nobody makes that. "Two left," Emily said, cutting through the chatter, her voice never rising, never wavering. "Marksmen, both elevated, and they're not panicking. Stay down, all of you. Stay down and stay still, because these two know what they're doing, and right now, they're looking for me." That killed the noise on the ridge instantly, because she was right. The last two were different. The machine gunner had died confident, and the launcher had died desperate, and the spotter had died in running, but the two marksmen on the high ground had done none of those things. They had gone to ground the moment the first shot cracked. They hadn't fled. They hadn't fired blind. They had simply vanished into the rocks, two trained shooters who understood exactly what was happening and who were now doing the very thing Emily did best. They were waiting. They were hunting. They were reading the ground for the flash or the movement or the mistake that would tell them where the Marines were hiding. And the convoy, which had finally understood that death was on the ridgeline, was scattering, which meant the ambush was broken, which meant the two marksmen no longer had a convoy to kill, but they had a sniper to kill instead, and they wanted her badly. "They know it's a shooter," Emily murmured, "one shooter taking them apart one at a time. That's more insulting to a man like that than losing. They're not going to run. They're going to come looking for me." Hayes' jaw tightened. "How do you want to play it?" "I don't move. They're waiting for me to move. First one to move loses. That's the whole game now." She let out a slow breath. "So we wait." And the waiting began. It was one thing Reynolds would realize later to lie still when nothing was happening. It was another thing entirely to lie still. When two enemy marksmen were hunting you, when a single twitch, a single flash off a lens, a single shift of weight against the rock would bring a bullet screaming across 800 meters into your skull. Every second stretched into something unbearable. His muscles screamed. Sweat ran into his eyes, and he did not wipe it. His heart slammed against his ribs so hard, he was sure they could hear it on the other ridge. Emily didn't move at all. She had become part of the ground. Her breathing had slowed to almost nothing. Her eyes stayed welded to her scope, patient endless, scanning the high rocks where the two marksmen had disappeared, waiting for the one mistake she knew would come, because everyone made it eventually. Everyone. You could not hold perfectly still forever. The body betrayed you, a cramp, an itch, a cloud of dust, something always something, and when it came, she would be ready and they would be dead. A minute passed, then two. "Chief," Cortez whispered, and there was fear cracking through his voice. "The convoy's clear. They're pulling out of the valley. We did it. We can just fall back. We don't have to." "We can't fall back," Emily said quietly. "The second we move, they see us. There's two of them, and there's a whole squad of us in a fixed position. If they get a firing solution on this ridge, they'll turn it into a slaughter. The only way this ends is I put them both down. So nobody moves. Nobody until I say." Reynolds understood then something that shamed him to his core. He understood that this was the part nobody talked about. Not the heroics, not the 5 shots. This. The waiting with death an inch away and no way out but through. The suffocating, unbearable stillness that took a kind of courage he did not have and was not sure he could ever have. He had spent a full day sneering at this woman for being weak. And here she was, holding the entire team's life in her hands, with a calm he could not begin to imagine, doing the very hardest thing a person could do, which was nothing, absolutely nothing, until the exact right moment. 3 minutes. The sun hammered down. Somewhere a lizard skittered across a rock, and every man on the ridge nearly jumped out of his skin. "There," Emily breathed. Reynolds saw nothing. "Where, Chief?" Where? Upper left, the shaded cleft. He's been there the whole time. Her voice was a thread of sound. He just got greedy. He shifted to get a better angle on us. Wants to catch us if we run. And when he shifted, a pause, the smallest pause, he put his shoulder in the sun. Reynolds strained through his scope, and finally he saw it. The faintest edge of a man where a moment ago there had been only shadow. A sliver of a shoulder catching the light. A mistake. The kind of mistake that meant nothing to anyone in the world except a sniper who had spent 10,000 hours learning to punish exactly that. "Four's got a partner," Emily said, "and the partner's going to see me shoot. The muzzle flashed the sound, he'll get a line on me the second I fire on his buddy. So this next part happens fast, and I only get one chance to do it clean, and if I get it wrong, the last one puts a round through my head before I can work the bolt." She said it without a trace of fear, the way another person might read a grocery list. "So here's what I need, Reynolds." Reynolds' whole body went rigid. "Chief, the second I fire on the one in the cleft, the last man is going to break cover to get an angle on my flash. He'll be exposed for maybe 1 second. Maybe less. I won't have time to find him myself. So you're going to find him for me. You're going to keep your scope on that upper ridge, and the instant he moves, you call it. Direction and distance from the cleft, fast and clear. You understand me." And there it was, the moment. She had put her own life in the hands of the man who yesterday had thrown her rifle across a barracks floor and sworn she'd get them all killed. She had chosen him. Out of everyone on that ridge, she had chosen Reynolds to be the eyes that kept her alive, and both of them knew exactly what that meant. Reynolds' mouth had gone bone dry. "Chief, His voice failed. He swallowed. "What if I'm too slow? What if I miss him? What if I—" "Then I die," Emily said simply. "And so do you. So don't be slow and don't miss him." A beat. "I'm trusting you, Reynolds. Whatever you've got against me, whatever you think I am, you put it down right now and you be my eyes. Can you do that?" For one endless second, the whole world narrowed to the two of them, the woman he'd hated and the man she'd chosen anyway. And Corporal Jake Reynolds, who had never in his life been half as brave as he pretended to be, felt something inside him break clean and reform into something harder and better. "I've got you," he said, and he meant it in a way he had never meant anything. "Take your shot. I've got your back." Emily settled behind the rifle. "Firing," she breathed. The fourth shot cracked across the valley, and in the shaded cleft, the marksman who'd gotten greedy died where he lay. And in the same instant, exactly as Emily had known he would, the last man on the ridge broke. He came up out of the rocks fast, swinging his rifle toward the source of the flash, a professional who understood he had 1 second to find his enemy and kill her before she killed him. He was good. He was very good. He knew where the shot had come from almost before the echo died, and he was already tracking toward Emily's position, and if he found her first, she was gone. "Right!" Reynolds roared, his voice tearing out of him. 2 o'clock off the cleft, 60 meters right high. He's up. He's up. He's got a line on you." Emily was already moving. Reynolds' call landed in her ear, and her rifle swung, and her eye found the last man in the exact place Reynolds had put him, a man rising out of the rock with his own weapon coming level, a man half a heartbeat from ending her. And in that half a heartbeat, Emily Carter did the thing she had spent her entire life learning how to do. She fired. The fifth shot echoed across the Mojave and rolled away into silence, and on the far ridge, the last enemy fighter dropped his rifle and pitched forward into the rocks and did not move. And then there was nothing. No gunfire, no engines, no sound at all but the wind moaning across the ridgeline and 12 men breathing like they'd just surfaced from deep water. 5 targets, 5 shots. The entire ambush erased from the earth before it had fired a single round in return. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Nobody could. They lay there in the sudden ringing quiet and stared at the far ridge where 5 men had been waiting to murder a convoy and where now there was only stillness, and they tried to make their minds accept what their eyes had just witnessed. It was Cortez who finally broke. He let out a shaking breath and dropped his forehead against the rock and said to no one and to everyone, "She got all 5. She got all 5 of them. Nobody even got a shot off. Nobody." He laughed a high, disbelieving, half-hysterical laugh. "I've been in this outfit 2 years, and I have never seen anything like that in my life." "Stay sharp," Hayes said, but even his voice was unsteady now. "Carter, talk to me. We clear." Emily didn't lift her eye from the scope for another full 30 seconds. She scanned the ridge corner to corner, methodical, unhurried, making absolutely certain that 5 was 5 and not 6. Only when she was sure did she finally ease back from the rifle and let out a long, slow breath. "We're clear," she said. "Convoy's out of the valley. Ambush is neutralized. It's done." And that was when it hit them. All of it, all at once. The men who had spent the last day laughing at her, doubting her, calling her a desk jockey and a liability, and worse, turned and looked at Emily Carter lying behind her rifle, and not one of them could find a single word. The silence that filled that ridge was not the silence of contempt anymore. It was the silence of men who had just watched someone do something they had believed impossible, done by a person they had sworn couldn't do it, and who now had to sit with the full weight of how wrong they had been. Reynolds was shaking. He didn't realize it at first. His hands, still gripping his rifle, were trembling so hard the barrel rattled against the rock. The adrenaline was draining out of him and leaving something raw behind, and he understood with a clarity that felt almost like physical pain that he had just been part of something. That when it mattered, when a woman's life had depended on his voice, he had not frozen. He had come through, and he had come through for her. For the person he'd been so sure was worthless. "Reynolds," Emily said. He looked over at her. He couldn't speak. "That was a good call," she said quietly. "You didn't hesitate. You put the last one right in my scope. I don't make that shot without you." She held his eyes for a moment. "Thank you." And Corporal Jake Reynolds, hard-nosed Marine, 12 years in the Corps, the loudest voice in every room he'd ever walked into, felt his throat close up and his eyes burn, and he had to look away before the whole team saw a grown man come apart on a ridge in the Mojave Desert. "Don't thank me," he managed finally, his voice thick. "Chief, don't you thank me. Not after," he shook his head. "Not after what I said to you. Not after what I did to your gear. Not after I—" He couldn't finish it. "You did your job when it counted," Emily said. "That's all that ever matters out here. The rest of it's just noise." But it wasn't just noise, and both of them knew it wasn't, because the thing that had happened between them on that ridge was bigger than a good call and a clean shot. It was a man being shown in the most undeniable way life can show a person that everything he thought he knew about strength and courage, and who deserved to stand beside him, was wrong. And you cannot come back from a thing like that. You cannot see what Reynolds had just seen and go back to being the man he'd been that morning. Hayes crawled over to Emily's position and settled beside her. And for a moment, the two of them just looked out at the valley where a convoy of strangers was driving away toward home. Never knowing how close they'd come to dying, never knowing the name of the woman who'd saved them. "You called it," Hayes said finally. "Last night, the South Ridge. You called it exactly. If we'd have set up the way the plan said and treated that ridge as empty—" He didn't finish. "They'd have caught the convoy in the open," Emily said. "The gunner alone would have killed half of them before anybody knew where it was coming from. And you knew. You knew before we ever left the wire." "I didn't know," Emily said. "I guessed. I put myself in their shoes, and I asked where I'd set up if I wanted to kill those trucks, and the answer was that ridge. That's the whole trick, Sergeant. There's no magic to it. You just have to be willing to think like the person trying to kill you." She paused. "Most people can't. It scares them too much. They'd rather hope the ridge is empty than face the idea that it isn't." Hayes was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I've served with a lot of shooters, Carter. Marines I'd have followed into hell. I'm not going to insult them by saying I've never seen their equal." He looked at her. "But I have never in my life seen anybody read a battlefield the way you just did. And I've never seen anybody make those 5 shots under that kind of pressure. Not once. Not in 20 years. He held out his hand. "I bet on you the second I shook your hand back at Pendleton. I want you to know that. I bet on you, and you just paid off bigger than I ever imagined." Emily shook his hand, and for the first time in a long time, something in her chest loosened just slightly. Because Hayes hadn't said it the way people usually said things to her. He hadn't said it like it was remarkable that a woman could do it. He'd said it like she was a shooter, like she was one of them, like the only thing that mattered was the work, and the work that he had spoken. But not everyone had made peace with it yet. There was a man named Doyle on the team. A big sour corporal who'd laughed loudest at every joke Reynolds had made, and who now lay a few feet away with an expression that had curdled into something ugly. Because some men, when they are proven wrong, grow from it. And some men only resent the person who proved them wrong. Doyle was the second kind. Lucky, he muttered just loud enough to carry. That's all that was. Right place, right day, wind held. Anybody can get lucky. The ridge went quiet in a different way now, a dangerous way. Reynolds turned his head slowly and looked at Doyle, and there was a warning in his eyes that hadn't been there an hour ago. Say that again, Reynolds said softly. Doyle blinked. I'm just saying, 5 for 5 at that range, that's not skill, that's luck. Nobody's that good. She caught a good day. I called the last shot for her, Reynolds said, and his voice was very quiet and very hard. I watched her put 4 rounds into 4 men who never saw it coming, and then I watched her drop a professional who had a beat on her in under a second off my call. And you want to lie there and tell me that's luck? He shook his head slowly. I said worse than that about her yesterday, Doyle. Worse than you just did. So believe me when I tell you, I know exactly what it sounds like coming out of your mouth. It sounds like a man who's too proud to admit what he just saw with his own 2 eyes. Doyle's face darkened. You've known her one day, Reynolds. One day. And now you're her guy. She bat her eyes at you or something. The words were barely out before Reynolds moved and Hayes' voice cracked across the ridge like a rifle shot. Enough! Hayes didn't yell it. He didn't have to. Doyle, you shut your mouth right now or so help me God. I will have you carrying every pound of gear off this mountain, and then I will make the rest of your enlistment a thing you tell your grandkids about. You watched what I watched. You know what it was, and if your pride's too small to say it out loud, then you keep your pride to yourself because I will not have it on my ridge. Are we understood? Doyle's jaw clenched, but he was not a stupid man, and he heard the iron in Hayes' voice and he backed down. Understood, Sergeant, he muttered. Good. Hayes turned back to the valley. Then we're done with that. But Emily had watched the whole exchange without a flicker of expression, and when it was over, she said mildly, almost gently, He's not entirely wrong, you know. Every head turned toward her. The wind did hold, she said. If it had shifted 2 miles an hour on the 4th shot, I'd have missed the man in the cleft, and the last one would have had all the time in the world to find me, and Reynolds' call wouldn't have mattered because I'd already be dead. She looked at Doyle evenly. Luck's always part of it. Anybody who tells you it isn't has never taken a shot that mattered. The difference is, luck can only help you if you've done everything else right first. You put in 10,000 hours so that when luck shows up, you're ready to use it. Doyle didn't say anything I don't say to myself after every single shot. A pause. Well, the part I take issue with is the word anybody. Because no, not anybody. That part he's got wrong. And somehow that undid Doyle more completely than anything Reynolds or Hayes could have said. Because she hadn't attacked him. She'd agreed with him, and then she'd shown him in about 15 words exactly how small his understanding of the thing really was. He had nothing to say to that. There was nothing to say. He looked away red-faced and did not open his mouth again. Cortez, watching, murmured under his breath, Man, she even wins the arguments she gives away. Emily heard him. The corner of her mouth twitched just barely. Get your gear together, Cortez. We're not out of the woods yet. Because they weren't. And that was the thing the euphoria had made them forget. They were still 8 miles deep in hostile country on a ridge that had just announced its position to anyone within earshot with 5 rifle shots, and there was no guarantee the 5 men on the far ridge were the only enemies in the valley. Carter's right, Hayes said, and the celebration drained out of the team as fast as it had come. 5 shots carry a long way out here. Anybody friendly with those 5 just heard exactly where we are. We move now, we move fast, and we move quiet. Cortez, take point. Reynolds, you've got rear security. He paused. Carter, you stay in the middle of the formation. You're the most valuable thing on this mountain right now, and I'm not losing you to some straggler with a lucky shot on the way home. I can hold my own, Sergeant, Emily said. I know you can. That's not the point. The point is, I've got 11 Marines who'd each take a bullet before they let one touch you, and every last one of them earned the right to feel that way about 5 minutes ago. So let them. Middle of the formation. That's an order. Emily looked at him, and then she nodded. Middle of the formation, she said. And that, more than the handshake, more than the thank you, was the thing that told her the wall had come down. Because Hayes hadn't said it like she was a woman who needed protecting. He'd said it like she was the most important shooter in the outfit, too valuable to risk the way you'd protect any irreplaceable asset. He'd folded her into the team not as a burden, but as its center of gravity. And every man who heard it understood the same thing. She wasn't the outsider anymore. She was one of them, maybe the best of them. They broke down the position and began the long descent, and the mood on the way down was nothing like the grim, testing silence of the climb up. The men moved with a new kind of energy, a quiet electric awareness that they had all just lived through something none of them would ever forget. And more than a few of them, as they picked their way down the rocks, found their eyes drifting to the woman in the middle of the formation, and found in themselves a feeling they were still learning how to hold. Not pity, not tolerance, respect. Hard, clean, earned in blood respect. They were maybe 2 miles down when Reynolds worked his way up through the formation until he was moving beside her. "Chief," he said, "can I say something?" "You can say something." He was quiet for a few steps, gathering it, and she let him. When he spoke again, his voice was low and rough. "When I was a kid, my old man used to tell me that a man's word was the only thing he really owned. Everything else could get taken from him. His money, his health, his home, but not his word unless he gave it away himself by breaking it." He swallowed. "I gave my word away yesterday, Chief. I stood in that barracks and I told the whole team you'd get us killed. I said it like I knew it, like it was fact." He shook his head. "And you saved every one of us. You saved that convoy. You saved me. And you did it after everything I said to you, after I put my hands on your gear, after I—" His voice cracked and he steadied it. "I don't have the words to fix that. I don't think there are words. But I need you to know that I know what I did, and I know what you did. And I'm going to spend the rest of my career trying to be the kind of Marine you were on that ridge today." Emily walked in silence for a moment. Then she said, "You want to know something, Reynolds? Yeah, you did fix it, on the ridge, when you called that last shot." She glanced at him. "You could have frozen, a lot of men would have. The pressure was through the roof, and my life was on your voice, and you had every reason in the world to lock up. But you didn't. You put your pride down, and you did the womb, and you saved my life doing that. That's not nothing. That's everything." She looked ahead again. People think the measure of a person is how they act when everything's easy, and everybody's watching. It's not. The measure of a person is what they do in the 1 second when it all comes apart, and nobody would blame them for failing. You had your second today, and you came through. So we're square. As far as I'm concerned, we've been square since the moment you yelled right." Reynolds couldn't answer that. He didn't trust his voice. So he just nodded and kept walking, and somewhere in the long silence that followed, a friendship that would last the rest of both their lives quietly took root in the hard ground between them. Behind them, Cortez had been listening, and he caught up to walk on Emily's other side. "Chief," he said, "I've got to ask, and you don't have to answer. But how'd you get this good nobody's-born shooting like that? What happened to you?" Emily was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke, there was something underneath her voice that hadn't been there before. Something older, heavier. "You really want to know?" "I do. I got this good," Emily said slowly, "because for a long time being this good was the only thing I had. There was a stretch of years where nobody expected anything from me. Nobody believed I'd amount to much, and I couldn't argue my way out of it because arguing never changed a single mind I ever met. So I stopped arguing. I found the one thing I could do better than anybody who ever doubted me, and I did it, and I did it, and I did it. 10,000 hours in the wind, in the cold, in the heat, until the day came when nobody could say a word to me because the results said it all." She looked at Cortez. "That's the secret, kid. That's the whole thing. You can't make people believe in you. You can't argue them into it. All you can do is get so good that believing in you stops being a choice." She paused. "The battlefield doesn't care what anybody thinks. It only asks one question, and today I answered it." Cortez didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He'd remember those words for the rest of his life, and one day, years later, he'd repeat them to a young Marine who was struggling, and he'd tell that Marine where he first heard them on a mountain in the Mojave from a Navy sniper who taught a whole squad of hard-headed men what strength actually looked like. They came off the mountain as the sun dropped toward the western hills, 12 exhausted, sunburned, silent people who had walked up that morning as strangers and were walking down as something else entirely. And as the friendly perimeter came into view, As the tension of the mission finally began to ease out of their shoulders, Hayes dropped back to walk beside Emily one last time. "You know they're going to want a full report," he said. "Command, what you saw, what you did. All 5 shots. This is going to go up the chain, Carter. Fast. There are people a lot higher than me who are going to hear about what happened on that ridge today." "I don't need them to hear about it," Emily said. "I know you don't. That's exactly why they're going to." Hayes almost smiled. "The ones who chase the recognition never deserve it. The ones who don't want it are the ones who earned it. You saved a dozen lives today and stopped an ambush cold, and you'd rather nobody ever mentioned it again. That's how I know it's going all the way to the top." He paused and his voice grew serious. "But there's something you should know before it does. Something you're not going to like." Emily looked at him. "What?" "The convoy you saved today," Hayes said quietly. "I know who was in it. I got the manifest before we left this morning. I didn't say anything because I didn't want it in anybody's head on the way up." He stopped walking. "It wasn't a supply convoy, Carter. Command lied about that, kept it need to know." The whole team had stopped now, sensing the shift, turning to listen. "What was it, Sergeant?" Emily asked slowly. Hayes looked at her for a likely moment, and then he told her exactly who had been riding in those trucks and why an enemy ambush team had been so carefully, so patiently, so professionally set up to make sure not one of them made it out of that valley alive. And when he said it, every last thing about the mission they thought they'd just finished changed shape in an instant, and Emily Carter understood, with a cold weight settling into her chest, that the 5 shots she'd fired on that ridge had not been the end of anything. And it was a personnel transfer, Hayes said. Diplomatic, 3 vehicles carrying a foreign envoy and his family. A man who just agreed to give our people intelligence that would have saved hundreds of lives. His wife was in the second truck. His 2 kids were in the back seat of that same truck. 9 years old and 6. The silence that fell over the team was different from every silence that had come before it that day. They knew, Emily said slowly, it wasn't a question. The enemy. They knew exactly what was in those trucks. That's why the ambush was so clean. That's why they had a machine gunner, a rocket, and 2 marksmen for 3 vehicles. That's not an ambush for a supply run, Sergeant. That's an execution. That's an execution, Dishay, Hayes agreed quietly. Reynolds felt the bottom drop out of his stomach. He thought about the second truck. He thought about the fact that he'd watched that truck roll into the open through his scope, and that if Emily's first shot had come a half-second later, if her hands had shaken the way his had, there would be 2 children lying dead in the wreckage of a burning vehicle in the bottom of that valley right now. "There were kids in that truck," he said, and his voice came out hollow. "Chief, there were kids in that truck, and I called you a liability. I said you'd get us killed. And you, He couldn't finish it. He turned away. "Reynolds," Emily said, "there were kids. Reynolds." Her voice cut through him low and firm. "Look at me." He turned back. "They're alive. You hear me? Whatever you said yesterday, it doesn't matter now, because those kids are alive and they're going home to grow up, and you were part of the reason why. Put the guilt down. We don't have room to carry it. Not yet." She looked at Hayes. "Because if Command lied to us about what was in those trucks, then Command knew this was more than a supply run. And if they knew that, then they knew there was a real chance of an ambush. And if they knew that," she stopped, "then why send 12 of us on foot with no air cover close enough to matter?" Hayes finished grimly. "Yeah, I've been chewing on that same bone since I read the manifest this morning." "Somebody wanted that convoy hit," Emily said quietly. The words landed on the team like a physical weight. "That's a hell of an accusation, Carter," Hayes said. "It is, and I hope I'm wrong." She looked out toward the perimeter, toward the base where the report would be filed and the questions would begin. But the enemy knew the route, the timing, the exact makeup of the convoy, and the fact that it was carrying an envoy who was about to hand us intelligence that would cost them dearly. That's not luck, Sergeant. Somebody fed them that. Somebody on our side of the line. And they sent us up that mountain thin and slow and half-blind, and I think they expected us to fail. I think we were supposed to be the ones who found the bodies, not the ones who stopped it. Nobody said a word, because every man there had just done the same math, and every man there had arrived at the same terrible number. "Then thank God for you," Cortez said quietly, "because whoever wanted this to happen, Chief, they didn't count on you." Emily didn't answer that. She was already somewhere else, already turning the thing over in her mind, already understanding that walking back onto that base was not going to be the end of the danger. It was going to be the beginning of a different kind. They came through the wire 20 minutes later, and the after action began almost immediately. A captain none of them recognized was waiting at the operations tent, a lean pressed officer named Whitlock, who wore the kind of blank, pleasant expression that experienced soldiers learn to distrust on sight. He shook Hayes' hand. He did not shake Emily's. "Sergeant Hayes," Whitlock said, "I understand the convoy passed through safely." "It did, sir. Thanks to Chief Carter here. Enemy had a 5-man ambush element set on the South Ridge. She spotted it, called it, and neutralized all 5 before they could engage." Whitlock's eyes flicked to Emily for the first time. "All 5? By herself?" "Yes, sir," Hayes said. "Extreme range hostile conditions 5 confirmed, and not one of them got a shot off." "That's correct, sir." Something moved behind Whitlock's pleasant face. Just for a moment. And Emily, who had spent her whole life reading the things people tried not to show, caught it and filed it away. It was not surprise. It was not admiration. It was something closer to displeasure, as though the captain had come here expecting a very different report and did not care for the one he was getting. "That's quite a story," Whitlock said mildly. "It's not a story, sir," Reynolds said, stepping forward before he could stop himself. "It's what happened. I called the last shot for her myself. I watched every one of them drop." Whitlock looked at Reynolds the way a man looks at a piece of furniture that has spoken out of turn. "And you are Corporal Reynolds, sir, and I'll put my name on every word of it." "I'm sure you will." Whitlock turned back to Hayes. "Sergeant, I'll need Chief Carter for a debrief. Alone, there are elements of this mission that are above the clearance of your team, and I need to walk through the engagement with her in detail." Hayes didn't move. "With respect, sir, my whole team witnessed the engagement. Anything you need to know, we can all—" "That wasn't a request, Sergeant." Whitlock's voice never rose, but the pleasantness had gone out of it. "The chief and I are going to have a conversation. You and your men are dismissed to see the corpsman and file your individual statements. Is that clear?" The tent went very still, and Emily Carter, standing there with the desert dust still on her, understood several things at once. She understood that Captain Whitlock had not come here to congratulate the team that had stopped a massacre. She understood that he was unhappy the massacre had been stopped. And she understood that whatever conversation he wanted to have with her alone, it was not going to be a debrief. It was going to be a warning, or worse. "It's fine, Sergeant," she said quietly. "I'll talk to the captain." Hayes looked at her, and a whole silent conversation passed between them in that look. He didn't like it. He didn't like any of it. But he was a soldier, and the order was lawful on its face, and there was nothing he could do but obey it. "We'll be right outside, Chief," he said, and the way he said it was a promise. The team filed out, but Reynolds hung back at the tent flap just for a second, and he caught Emily's eye, and he mouthed 2 words at her. "Watch him." She gave him the smallest nod. And then he was gone, and it was just Emily and the captain and the low hum of the generators outside. Whitlock waited until the flap had settled. Then he gestured to a folding chair. "Sit, Chief." "I'll stand, sir." "Suit yourself." He walked slowly around the table in the center of the tent, and when he spoke again, his voice had changed entirely. Gone was the mild bureaucrat. What was left was something harder and colder. "You've caused me a considerable problem today, Chief Carter. I want you to understand that. I stopped an enemy ambush from killing a convoy full of civilians, sir, including 2 children. If that's a problem for you, then I think you and I have very different jobs." "Do we?" Whitlock stopped and looked at her. "You were told this was a supply convoy. You were told to observe, report, and protect. You were not told to single-handedly turn a routine reconnaissance into an international incident. That envoy was a sensitive matter, Chief. There were negotiations in play. Balances, things far above your pay grade that were being managed very carefully by people who understand the full picture. And you walked onto that ridge and blew a hole in the middle of it with 5 rifle shots." Emily's expression didn't change, but something behind her eyes went to ice. "You want to run that by me again, sir," she said slowly. "Because it almost sounded like you're telling me those people were supposed to die. I'm telling you that you don't understand what you were part of. I understand there were 2 kids in the second truck. I understand a machine gun team was set up to make sure they burned. And I understand that you walked in here disappointed to hear they're alive. Her voice was flat and terrible. So why don't you go ahead and explain to me the part I'm too low a pay grade to grasp? The part where a man wearing this uniform is sorry a 6-year-old didn't die in the desert today. I'd love to hear that part, Captain. Whitlock's face darkened. You watch your mouth, Chief. You are speaking to a superior officer. I'm speaking to somebody wearing the rank of one, Emily said. That's not the same thing. And every second you stand there being angry that I did my job instead of being on the radio, making sure that Envoy and his family are safe, tells me more about you than any debrief ever could. For a long moment, the two of them stood there in the humming tent, and the mask came all the way off Whitlock's face, and what was underneath it was not pleasant at all. You have no idea what you've stepped into, he said softly. You think you saved somebody today. You think you're a hero. Let me tell you what you actually did. You made yourself a very inconvenient loose end for some extremely powerful people. And loose ends, Chief, have a way of getting cut. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to file a clean, simple report. Supply convoy, enemy contact, threat neutralized. You're going to leave out your little theory about the manifest. You're going to leave out anything you think you figured out about who knew what. And then you're going to rotate back to your unit and forget this ever happened. And if you do all that, then maybe this stays a story about a lucky sniper and nothing more. And if I don't, Whitlock smiled, and it was the coldest thing she'd seen all day. Then you'll find out how quickly a hero becomes a problem, how fast 5 clean kills turn into an unauthorized engagement, how easy it is to end a career, Chief, or something more permanent than a career. And there it was, the threat spoken plainly at last. Emily Carter looked at the captain for a long, long moment, and then she did something that took Whitlock completely off guard. She smiled back. You know what the funny thing is, Captain, she said. For 29 years, people have been walking up to me and explaining real slow all the reasons I should sit down and be quiet and stay in my lane my whole life. And every single one of them made the exact same mistake you're making right now. She leaned in slightly. They thought I wanted something they could take away. They thought I was afraid of losing my career or my reputation or their approval. And that's how they got leverage on me. But I figured out a long time ago that the only way somebody can control you is if there's something you're more afraid of losing than you are of doing the right thing. And I don't have that thing anymore, Captain. I burned it out of myself a long time ago, on a lot of ridges, in a lot of wind. So you can threaten my career all you want. You can threaten worse. It won't move me an inch, because I already know exactly who I am. And I know exactly what I saw, and there is nothing you can offer me, and nothing you can take from me that will make me file a report that says 2 children were an acceptable loss. Whitlock's jaw tightened. You're making a serious mistake. Maybe, Emily said, but it'll be mine. Now, if you're done, sir, I've got a report to file. The true one whacked. And she turned and walked out of the tent, leaving Captain Whitlock standing alone with the humming generators and the first real fear he'd felt in a very long time. Outside, the team was waiting exactly where they'd said they'd be. All of them. Hayes at the front, arms crossed. Reynolds beside him. Cortez, Doyle, all of them, a wall of Marines, standing in the fading light. And when Emily came out of that tent, every one of them read her face and knew that something had gone very wrong in there. Chief, Hayes said, what happened? Emily looked at the wall of men in front of her. The same men who had laughed at her a day ago. The same men who had sworn she didn't belong. And she made a decision. I'm going to tell you all something, she said quietly. And once I tell you, you're going to be part of it, whether you want to be or not. So if any of you would rather walk away and keep your hands clean, now's the time. I won't hold it against a single one of you. Nobody moved. Nobody's walking anywhere, Chief Reynolds said. Say your piece. So she told them. She told them everything Whitlock had said. The threats, the order to bury the truth, the clear, cold implication that the ambush had not been a surprise to everyone on their own side. And with every word, the faces of the men in front of her grew harder and darker, until by the time she finished, the mood in that little circle was something close to dangerous. He threatened you, Reynolds said. His voice was very quiet. He stood in that tent and threatened your life because you stopped somebody from murdering 2 kids. That's about the size of it. Then he's not walking off this base, Doyle growled, and it was the first thing Doyle had said all day that put him on the same side as the rest of them. Whatever pride had made him call her lucky on the ridge, it was gone now, burned away by something older and simpler than pride. You don't threaten one of ours. I don't care what's on his collar. Stand down, Doyle, Hayes said. But he said it without much force because part of him wanted to say the same thing. He was quiet for a moment, thinking, his mind working through the angles the way it always did. Carter, this captain, Whitlock. You ever hear that name before today? No. Neither have I. And I know just about everybody who rotates through this command. Hayes's eyes narrowed, which means he came from somewhere else, somewhere higher. Somebody sent him here specifically to manage what happened on that ridge. And they sent him fast because he was waiting for us when we came through the wire, which means he knew about the engagement before we ever filed a word of it. He looked at Emily. Somebody's watching this in real time, Chief. Somebody with reach. This is bigger than one bent captain. I know, Emily said. So what do we do? Cortez asked. He was young and he was scared and he didn't try to hide it. If it's that big, if they've got that kind of reach, Chief, they could make all of us disappear. They could bury the whole thing. Who do we even tell? And that was the question, wasn't it? That was the trap Whitlock had been counting on. The higher up the rot went, the fewer people you could trust until you couldn't be sure of anyone, until the safest thing in the world seemed to be silence. Emily was quiet for a long moment, and then she said something that surprised all of them. We don't tell anybody, not yet. Chief, listen to me. Whitlock thinks he's got two options in front of him. Either I stay quiet and he wins, or I make noise and he crushes me before it spreads. He's ready for both. What he's not ready for is the truth, complete and documented, sitting somewhere he can't reach, held by people he doesn't know about, ready to come out all at once if anything happens to any of us. She looked around the circle. The manifest, that's the key. Hayes, you saw it. You read who was in those trucks. Is there a copy, a physical copy, a digital one, anything? Hayes's face went still. I read it off a tablet in the briefing tent this morning. Command's tablet, which means the record's in their system. He paused. But I photographed it. Force of habit. I photograph every manifest before a mission because I learned the hard way that command changes the story after the fact. It's on my personal device. The circle went very quiet. Then that photograph, Emily said slowly, is the only piece of hard evidence that command knew exactly who was in that convoy, that they knew it wasn't a supply run, and that they sent us up that mountain anyway. She looked at Hayes. Sergeant, right now, that photo is the most dangerous object on this base. If Whitlock knew it existed, he'd tear this whole camp apart to find it, which means we've got a small window before anybody realizes what we've got, and we have to use it. Use it how? Reynolds asked. We get it out, off the base, to somebody outside this chain of command who can't be reached by whoever sent Whitlock. A journalist, an inspector general, someone. Copies in more than one place with instructions that if anything happens to us, it all goes public at once. She looked around the circle. That's the only kind of insurance that works against people like this. You don't fight them by making noise. You fight them by making it so that hurting you is the worst possible thing they could do. That's treason talk, some folks would call it, Doyle said, but he didn't say it like an accusation. He said it like a man testing the weight of a thing he was about to pick up anyway. It's not treason to tell the truth about a war crime your own side helped set up, Emily said flatly. The oath we took wasn't to a captain named Whitlock or whoever sent him. It was to the Constitution. And there's nothing in the Constitution that says you look the other way when somebody with rank tries to get two kids killed and then threatens to murder the person who stopped it. She looked around at them, one face at a time. But I meant what I said. The second Hayes moves that photo, every one of us is in it. All the way in. There's no clean way out after that. So I'll ask one more time. Anybody wants to walk now? The silence stretched, and then one by one the Marines of Delta Recon answered her. Not with speeches. Marines don't make speeches. They answered the way Marines do. I'm in, Cortez said. His voice shook, but he said it. In, said Doyle. In, said the man beside him, and the man beside him, and the man beside him, down the whole line, 12 voices until the circle was closed. Reynolds was last. He looked at Emily for a long moment. 24 hours ago, he said, I threw your rifle across a barracks and told a room full of men you'd get us all killed. He shook his head slowly. And now I'm about to put my career, my freedom, and probably my life on the line to protect you because you're the most honorable person I've ever served with. Life's a strange thing, Chief, he strayed on. I'm in, all the way, to the end of it, whatever the end is. Emily looked at the 12 of them, standing there in the last of the light, this circle of hard-tired, sunburned men who had walked up a mountain that morning, her enemies, and were standing here now as something she'd never had before. Not a unit that tolerated her, not a team that had learned to respect her skills. A group of people who had looked at the truth and looked at her and decided all of them to stand between her and the people who wanted her silenced. Something moved in her chest that she had spent a very long time not letting herself feel. All right, she said, and her voice was steady but only just. Then here's how we're going to do it. And that was the moment Hayes's personal device buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, looked at the screen, and every drop of color drained out of his face. Chief, he said slowly. The photo, the manifest photo. He turned the screen toward her. It's gone, every copy. My device just wiped the entire folder 30 seconds ago. Remote wipe. Somebody reached into my phone and deleted it. He looked up, and his eyes were wide. They know. Whitlock already knows we have it, or had it. And if they can reach into my personal phone from wherever they are, then they can reach anything on this base, Emily finished. The circle of men went dead silent. And in that silence from across the compound, headlights snapped on. 2 vehicles, then a third, engines turning over, moving toward them out of the dark with the slow, deliberate purpose of people who were in no particular hurry because they already knew their targets weren't going anywhere. Reynolds' hand drifted toward his sidearm. Chief, he said quietly, whatever you're going to say, you'd better say it fast, because I don't think that's the welcome wagon. Emily Carter watched the headlights come, and her mind was already moving, and already 3 steps ahead, already cold and clear and calm, the way it always went when everything came apart at once. She had lost the evidence. She had lost her window. She had a captain who wanted her dead, and a chain of command she couldn't trust, and 12 men who just tied their fate to hers and headlights rolling toward them in the dark. And she smiled that small, patient smile the men were only just beginning to understand. Nobody reaches for a weapon, she said quietly. Nobody does anything, because they think they just took away the only thing we had. Her eyes tracked the approaching lights. Let them keep thinking that, because the manifest photo was never the real insurance boys. She looked around the circle one last time as the vehicles rolled to a stop and doors began to open. And in about 30 seconds, the man who sent those trucks is going to find out exactly what he actually walked into when he threatened me in that tent. Captain Whitlock stepped out of the lead vehicle with 2 men behind him, and the confidence in his walk said he believed he'd already won. Chief Carter, he called out across the dark, I gave you a very simple choice about an hour ago. File a clean report, keep your career, walk away. And instead, you gathered your little squad and started talking about manifests and evidence and going outside the chain of command. He stopped a few yards away. You should know your sergeant's phone has already been handled. Whatever you thought you had, you don't have it anymore. So this is me being generous one last time. Everybody's tired. It's been a long day. Let's not make it longer than it needs to be. Emily didn't move. You wiped a phone, Captain. Congratulations. You want to tell me how you did that, by the way? Reaching into a Marine's personal device on a secure base? That's not a bent captain. That takes real infrastructure. That takes people. You just told me more about how big this is than you meant to. Whitlock's jaw tightened. You're a smart woman. Be smart now. Smart. I'm being very smart, Emily said. You just don't like the direction it's pointing. She took a slow step forward, and behind her 12 Marines shifted their weight in a way that made Whitlock's 2 men go tense. Let me tell you what you did wrong today, Captain. You came in here thinking the manifest photo was the threat. You spent all your infrastructure and all your reach making that photo disappear, and right now you're standing there feeling clever about it. But you made the oldest mistake there is. You went after the evidence you could see, and you never once asked yourself what you couldn't. There's nothing else. There's always something else. Emily's voice was calm as still water. You threatened my life in that tent, Captain. You told me how easy it is to end a career, or something more permanent. You said it out loud, just the 2 of us, no witnesses. She let that hang. At least that's what you thought. And Whitlock's certainty cracked just for an instant right down the middle. Sergeant Hayes, Emily said without turning around. Would you tell the captain what you and the boys set up while I was walking to that tent? Hayes stepped up beside her, and there was something almost pleasant in his voice. The pleasure of a man laying down a card he'd been holding all night. When Whitlock pulled you aside, Chief, I didn't like the look of it. So while you were walking over, I had Cortez here slip a comms recorder into the ground sheeting by the tent flap. Old trick. Motor pool guys use it to catch people stealing parts. It's been transmitting to 3 separate devices the whole time. He allowed himself a small, hard smile. So every word the captain said to you in that tent about how inconvenient those children were about ending your career or something more permanent. And all of it, it's sitting on 3 phones right now. And no, Captain, they're not on this base. I sent them out with the supply rotation that left 40 minutes ago. They're already gone. The silence that followed was the sound of a man realizing the ground had disappeared from under his feet. You're bluffing, Whitlock said, but his voice had changed. Am I? Emily said. You want to bet your freedom on it? Because here's the thing about people like you, Captain. You're so used to being the one holding the leverage that you never once stopped to think somebody might be holding it on you. She took another step. You reached into a phone to wipe a photo, and you thought that was checkmate. But the photo was never the whole game. The photo proved Command knew the convoy's contents. Your own voice in that tent proves you knew what the ambush was and that you wanted it to succeed. And you handed me that for free because you were so busy trying to scare me that you forgot the first rule anybody in your line of work should know. Never say out loud what you can't afford to have recorded. One of Whitlock's men shifted and his hand moved toward his jacket. Every Marine in the circle moved at once. I would think very hard about that, Reynolds said quietly, and his sidearm was already in his hand, low and steady, pointed at the ground, but ready. There are 12 of us and 3 of you, and every one of us just watched this woman make 5 impossible shots to save 2 kids. You people were ready to write off, so go ahead. Reach into that jacket. Give us a reason. I am begging you. The man froze. He looked at Whitlock. Whitlock said nothing because Whitlock was doing math, and the math was not coming out the way he'd planned. Here's how this goes now, Captain, Emily said. You're going to get back in your vehicle, you and your 2 friends, and you're going to drive off this base, and you're going to go straight to whoever sent you, and you're going to tell them the truth. Tell them there's a recording. Tell them there are copies in places they can't reach, held by people they don't know. Set to release everything if anything happens to me or to any of the men standing behind me. Tell them the loose end they wanted cut just became the one thing they can't touch. Her voice dropped cold and final. And tell them one more thing. Tell them that if that envoy or his wife or either of those 2 children so much as trips on a curb in the next 50 years, every second of that recording goes to every journalist in the country by sundown. Their protection is my protection now. You threaten them, you threaten me, and you just found out today how that works out. Whitlock stared at her, and in his eyes for the first time was something like fear. Not fear of her, fear of the people above him and what they would do to him when he came back with this. You have no idea what you've done, he said quietly. I saved 4 lives on a ridge today, Emily said. 2 of them belonged to children. That's exactly what I've done, and I'd do it again 1,000 times. Now get off my base, Captain, before one of these Marines decides your career isn't the thing that should end tonight. For a long, taut moment, nobody moved, and then Whitlock slowly turned and walked back to his vehicle. His 2 men followed. The doors slammed, the engines turned over, and the 3 vehicles rolled back into the dark the way they'd come, and the circle of Marines stood there in the silence listening to the sound of them fade until it was gone entirely and the only sound left was the desert wind. Cortez let out a breath that seemed to come from the bottom of his soul. Chief, was that real, the recorder? Or were you bluffing him? Emily turned to Hayes. Hayes reached into his pocket and pulled out a small recording device, the kind that costs $30 at any electronics store, and held it up. Oh, it's real, he said. Every word. I just didn't send it out with the supply rotation. That part I made up on the spot. He grinned. It's been in my pocket the whole time. But he doesn't know that. And by the time he figures it out, the copies really will be gone because we're going to make them right now tonight and send them to every safe pair of hands we can find before the sun comes up. Cortez started laughing, half in relief and half in disbelief. You bluffed a bluff. You told him the copies were already gone, so he wouldn't try to stop them from leaving, and now we go make them for real. Now you're getting it, Emily said. And for the first time all day, something like a real smile crossed her face. But it didn't last, because the truth of what they'd stepped into was settling over all of them now, and it was heavier than any of them wanted to admit. They're not going to just let this go, Reynolds said quietly. He'd holstered his sidearm, but his hand still hovered near it, the way a man's hand does when he's learned the hard way that danger doesn't always announce itself twice. Chief, people with that kind of reach, they wiped a phone from a distance. They had a captain waiting for us before we filed a word. That recording buys us protection, sure, but it also makes us the most dangerous people they know. Men like that don't sleep easy with a threat like us walking around. No, Emily agreed, Erebun. They don't, which is why the recording can't just sit as a threat. A threat you never use, they eventually decide to test. We use it, not to destroy them, to make ourselves useless, to destroy. She looked around the circle. The recording goes to an inspector general, to a specific journalist I know who's covered military corruption before and can't be leaned on, and to one more place. She paused. The envoy, the man we saved. Because he's about to hand our intelligence people information that will save hundreds of lives, which makes him valuable, which makes him protected, which means anybody standing next to him is protected too. We don't hide from the people who wanted him dead. We stand right next to the man they need alive, and we dare them. Hayes was watching her with something close to wonder. You've been thinking about this since the tent. I've been thinking about this since I saw Whitlock's face when you said all 5 were down, Emily said. A man doesn't look disappointed that an ambush failed unless he already knew there was going to be one. Everything since then has just been filling in the shape of it. She rubbed a hand across her eyes, and for just a second, the exhaustion showed through the sheer weight of a day that had started with men laughing at her in a barracks and had somehow arrived here, standing in the dark, facing down people who wanted her erased. I didn't ask for any of this. I want you all to know that. I came here to do a cha, watch a carnival, go home. That's all I ever want, the Galvin then home. She dropped her hand. But you don't get to choose the day the truth lands in your lap. You only get to choose what you do with it. And I'm not built to look away. I never have been. It's cost me most of my life being built like that. But it's mine, and I'm not going to apologize for it now. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Doyle of all people stepped forward. Doyle, who had called her lucky on the ridge. Doyle, who'd needed Hayes to shut him up. He stood in front of her, and he looked more uncomfortable than any of them had ever seen him, a big, hard man wrestling with something that didn't come easy. Chief, he said, I owe you an apology, and I'm not good at these, so I'm just going to say it straight. He swallowed. I called you lucky, on the ridge. After you did the most impressive thing I've seen in 11 years of service, I lay there, and I called it luck because I couldn't stand that a woman I'd never met just did something none of us could do. That was small. That was as small as a man gets. He met her eyes. And then tonight I watched you stand in front of a man who threatened your life and turn it around on him with nothing but nerve and a $30 recorder and protect not just yourself, but all of us and 2 kids and an envoy you never met. And I realize I've spent 11 years thinking I understood what a warrior was, and I didn't know a damn thing until today. So I'm sorry, and I'm with you, and I'll say that in front of anybody anywhere for the rest of my life. Emily looked at him for a long moment, and then she stuck out her hand. That's the hardest kind of apology there is, Doyle, she said. The kind where you have to admit the ugly part out loud. Takes more guts than the ridge did. She shook his hand. We're square. And thank you. It means more than the compliments do. Anybody can hand out a compliment. It takes a real man to hand out an apology. Doyle nodded, and there was something wet in his eyes that he blinked away fast, and he stepped back into the circle, a different man than he'd been that morning. They spent that night doing the work. Cortez, who turned out to be quietly good with electronics, made clean copies of the recording. Hayes wrote out a full statement, teams and names, and the exact wording of the manifest he'd read that morning, everything he could remember, signed and dated. Emily wrote her own account of the tent. Reynolds wrote his account of the ridge, of the last shot of everything he'd witnessed. One by one, the men added their voices until what they had was not one person's word against a captain's, but 12 sworn statements in a recording of Whitlock's own voice, all pointing the same direction. And somewhere in the small hours of the morning as they worked, Reynolds found himself sitting next to Emily at a folding table, the two of them alone for a moment, while the others slept in shifts. "Can I ask you something, Chief?" he said quietly. "You keep asking if you can ask. Just ask Reynolds." He almost smiled. "That thing you said on the mountain, about how you can't argue people into believing in you, about how you just have to get so good that believing stops being a choice." He turned his cup slowly in his hands. "How long did that take to stop caring what people like me thought? Because I've been a Marine 12 years, and I still care so much what people think of me. It eats me alive some nights. And you walked into a room full of us hating you, and you didn't blink. I want to know how you got there." Emily was quiet for a long time. "You want the honest answer," she said finally. "I'm not sure I ever fully got there. I don't think anybody does, not all the way. It still stings, Reynolds. When you and the others laughed at me in that barracks yesterday, it stung. It always stings." She looked down at her hands. "What changed isn't that it stopped hurting. What changed is that I stopped letting the hurt drive. There was a time I'd have spent all my energy trying to make you like me, trying to explain myself, trying to earn a seat at a table that had already decided I didn't belong. And it never worked. Not once. Because you can't argue somebody out of a thing they didn't reason themselves into." She met his eyes. "So one day I just stopped. I decided I was going to do the work quietly, the best anybody had ever done it, and I was going to let the results do the talking, and if people came around, fine, and if they didn't, that was their loss to carry, not mine. It's not that I stopped caring. It's that I stopped waiting. I stopped putting my life on hold to wait for permission from people who were never going to give it." Reynolds sat with that for a long moment. "That's the loneliest thing I've ever heard," he said quietly, "and also maybe the strongest." "They're the same thing more often than people want to admit," Emily said. "The strong ones are usually the ones who learn to stand up without anybody holding them. That's not a gift, Reynolds. Nobody would choose it. It's a scar that learned to be useful." She stood gathering the papers. "But I'll tell you what today gave me that I didn't expect. For the first time in a long time, I'm not standing alone. 12 of you decided to stand with me on nothing but the truth, against people who could ruin you. You have no idea what that's worth to somebody who got used to doing everything by herself." Her voice caught just slightly. "So thank you, all of you. I'll carry today a long time. The good part of it, I mean. Not the captain, you." Reynolds didn't trust himself to answer. He just nodded and watched her walk the papers over to the growing stack of evidence and thought that he had never in his life been so ashamed of who he'd been the day before or so determined to be better because of who she'd shown him he could be. By dawn, it was done. 3 copies of everything headed for 3 destinations no one on that base could reach. And by the time the sun came up over the Mojave, the balance of power had quietly, completely inverted. Whitlock and whoever sent him didn't know it yet, but they had lost. Not because Emily had outshot them, because she had outthought them, and because 12 men who'd once doubted her had chosen in the end to make her fight their own. The reckoning came 11 days later. It came in the form of a phalanx of investigators from an office none of them had ever heard of arriving, without warning, moving with the cold efficiency of people who already knew what they were looking for. The recording had reached the right hands. The journalist had made a single carefully worded phone call to the right office, and that call had set something in motion that not even Whitlock's people could stop, because the moment it became clear the story was already outside the fence. Protecting the perpetrators became more dangerous than exposing them. Whitlock was arrested at a base 3 states away trying to rotate out ahead of the storm. The people above him proved harder to reach, insulated by rank and money. In the careful distance the powerful always keep between themselves and their own dirty work. Some of them never faced a courtroom. Emily had known they wouldn't. That wasn't how it worked, and she'd made her peace with that a long time ago. You didn't get to burn the whole rotten structure down. You gotta save the people in front of you and expose enough of the truth that the next set of children in the next set of trucks had a better chance. That was the job. It had always been the job. But the envoy lived, his wife lived, and 2 children, a 9-year-old and a 6-year-old, grew up on the far side of the world, never knowing how close they'd come to dying in a desert valley or the name of the woman who'd lain on a ridge in 110-degree heat and fired 5 impossible shots to make sure they got to grow up at all. Emily Carter never told them. She never told anyone, really. That wasn't why she'd done it. And on the day the investigators finally finished with Delta Recon, on the day the team was cleared of any wrongdoing and quietly commended for actions that the official record would only ever describe in the vaguest possible terms, Sergeant Marcus Hayes gathered his men one last time before Emily rotated back to her own unit. "I'm not going to make a speech," Hayes said. "You all know I hate speeches." A few of the men laughed. "But I've been doing this a long time, and I've served with a lot of people. And I want to say one thing on the record in front of all of you." He turned to Emily. 11 days ago, half the men in this outfit didn't think you belonged here. Some of them said so out loud. Some of them said worse. And you didn't argue with a single one of them. You just did the work. And then, when it counted, when it would have been so easy to file the clean report and save yourself and let 2 kids and their parents pay the price, you put everything you had on the line for people you'd never met, and you dragged the truth into the light with your bare hands, and you made us all better for having stood next to you while you did it. He drew himself up, and he did something Emily had never once seen a Marine sergeant do for a Navy chief. He saluted her, slow and precise and absolutely sincere. And every man in Delta Recon, all 12 of them, came to attention and saluted her too. Emily Carter stood there in the desert morning in front of 12 Marines who had walked up a mountain hating her and had come to stand here saluting her, and for the first time in more years than she could count, the woman who had taught herself to stand alone found she couldn't quite hold it together. Her throat closed, her eyes burned, and she let it show just for a moment, just this once, because these men had earned the right to see it. She came to attention, and she returned the salute. "It was an honor," she said, and her voice was rough. "Every one of you, even the parts where you were wrong." A few of them laughed through the emotion of it, especially those parts. Because watching a person admit they were wrong and choose to be better anyway, that's the finest thing I know. Better than any shot I ever made. You didn't just come around, you changed. And that's the hardest thing a person ever does. She let her hand drop. "I came here to do a job and go home. And I'm going home today. But I want you to know I'm not leaving the way I came. I came here alone. I'm leaving with 12 brothers I didn't have 11 days ago, and I will carry that for the rest of my life." Reynolds stepped forward, and this time when he reached for her gear bag, she let him. "Let me carry it, Chief," he said quietly. "Just to the vehicle. Just this once." Emily looked at him, and she remembered the ridge and the extraction and the man who'd once thrown this same bag across a barracks floor, now standing in front of her, asking for the honor of carrying it. "I can carry my own gear, Reynolds," she said. "You know I can." "I know," he said, "but today you carried all of us, so let me get the bag." And it was almost the exact thing he'd said on the ridge, the thing that had made her smile for the first time, and hearing it now at the end closed a circle that had opened the moment she'd stepped out of that sedan into a yard full of men who didn't believe in her. Emily let go of the bag. Reynolds took it, and the whole team walked her to the vehicle together in the clean light of a desert morning, and not one of them, if you'd asked, could have told you exactly when it happened, the moment the woman they didn't believe in became the person they'd have followed anywhere. But it had happened, and every one of them knew it, and none of them would ever be the same. The vehicle pulled away from Camp Pendleton, and Emily Carter watched 12 Marines grow smaller in the side mirror until the desert swallowed them, and she thought that would be the end of it. She was wrong about that. It was only the beginning of what the story would become. Because a thing like what happened on that ridge doesn't stay buried. It moves. It travels the way true stories always travel through a military, from a whispered account in a chow hall to a longer telling in a barracks after lights out, growing in the retelling, not because anyone lied, but because the truth was already large enough to sound like a legend. And within a few months, the story of the Navy sniper who dropped 5 men to save 2 children and then stood down a corrupt captain with nothing but nerve and a $30 recorder had spread far beyond the 12 men who'd lived it. Emily didn't tell it. That was the thing people always got wrong when they heard it later. She never told the story once, not at a bar, not to a new unit, not even to family. The men of Delta Recon told it. Reynolds, most of all. That surprised everyone who'd known him before. Because Corporal Jake Reynolds, who had walked into that briefing room, Certain that a woman couldn't watch his back, became the loudest and fiercest defender of Emily Carter's reputation in the entire Corps. Anywhere he went after that, any new posting, any bar, any room, where some man started running his mouth about how women didn't belong in combat, Reynolds would set down his drink and tell them about a ridge in the Mojave. He'd tell it plain, no exaggeration, because the truth needed none. And when he got to the part about the last shot, the part where his own voice had been the only thing between Emily and a bullet, his voice would go quiet every time, and the room would go quiet with it. "I called her a liability," he'd say. "I threw her rifle across a barracks and told a room full of Marines she'd get us killed. And 11 days later, I'd have taken a bullet for her without a half second of hesitation. You want to know what changed my mind? It wasn't a speech. It wasn't a policy. It was watching her be better than me at the thing I was proudest of, and then watching her risk everything to protect people who'd never even know her name. That's what a warrior is. I had it wrong my whole life. She's the one who taught me right." There was a young private who heard him tell it once 3 years later at a base clear across the country. A kid who was struggling, who'd been told he didn't have what it took, who was one bad week from quitting. And Reynolds, seeing something in him, pulled him aside afterward and told him the other part. The part Emily had told Cortez on the mountain. "You can't argue people into believing in you," Reynolds said. "I learned that from the best I ever served with. You just get so good that believing stops being a choice. You do the work when nobody's watching and nobody's clapping and nobody thinks you'll amount to anything. And one day the work speaks so loud that all the people who doubted you don't get a vote anymore." He put a hand on the kid's shoulder. "That's how she did it. That's how you'll do it too. Now get back out there." That private stayed in, made a career of it, and years later he told a struggling recruit of his own the same thing, and never once knew that the words had started with a woman on a ridge he'd never see, whose name he'd never learn. That was how her story really traveled. Not in the retelling of the 5 shots. In the quiet moments passed hand to hand when one person told another that they were worth more than the people doubting them believed. Emily never knew about most of it. That was the part that would have surprised her most if she'd ever found out. She went back to her unit. She did her job. She rotated through more postings, more missions, more rooms full of strangers who took one look at her and decided before she'd said a word exactly what she was and wasn't capable of. And every single time she did the same thing she'd always done. She said nothing. She did the work, and she let the results speak the way they always had. But something was different now, because for the first time in her career, she wasn't entirely alone out there. Reynolds wrote her. So did Cortez, who turned out to be a natural writer. Long letters full of updates and questions, and the occasional request for advice on a shot he was working through. Hayes wrote 2 shorter notes in a blunt hand, checking in the way an old sergeant checks in, never saying much, but always saying it when it mattered. Even Doyle wrote once a year, every year on the anniversary of the Ridge. The letters were always short. They always said the same thing more or less. "Still square, Chief, still with you." And Emily kept every one of them in a box she didn't tell anyone about. And on the hard nights, the nights when the old loneliness crept back in and whispered that she'd always be the outsider, that nobody would ever really let her in, she'd take out that box and read those letters and remember that 12 men had once looked at the truth and chosen her. It was enough. It was more than she'd ever expected to have. The children she saved grew up. The 9-year-old became a doctor. The 6-year-old became a teacher. They lived ordinary, beautiful lives on the far side of the world, and they never knew how close they'd come to the end of everything. And they never learned the name of the woman who'd made sure they got to have those lives at all. Emily wanted it that way. She'd meant what she said in the tent. She hadn't done it for recognition. She'd done it because 2 children were about to die, and she was the only person on earth positioned to stop it. And for Emily Carter, that was the beginning and end of the entire question. But their father knew, the envoy. He never forgot. And years later, when he'd risen to a position of real influence, when his intelligence had saved the hundreds of lives that everyone had known it would, he made a quiet inquiry through channels, and he learned the name of the sniper who'd saved his family, and he wrote her a single letter. Emily read it alone. It was not a long-range letter. Men who have carried real weight rarely use many words. He told her that he had 2 children who were alive because of her. He told her that everything he had done since that day, every life his work had saved, existed only because she had chosen to fire 5 shots on a ridge instead of accepting the loss the way powerful men had wanted her to. He told her that she would never fully know the size of what she'd set in motion, the ripple of it, the touching lives, all flowing outward from one woman's refusal to look away. And he closed the letter with a single line that Emily read a dozen times and then folded carefully and placed in the box with the others. "You did not save my children," he wrote. "You saved everyone my children will ever save, and everyone they will save unto the end of the world." That is what one right choice becomes. I hope you carry it lightly. It is a great weight, and you have earned the right to set it down and simply know that it was good. Emily sat with that for a long time. Because that was the thing nobody told you when you signed up to be a person who did the right thing at the cost of everything else. Nobody told you that most of the time you'd never see the fruit of it. You'd fire the shot and stop the ambush and walk off the mountain and never know what the lives you saved went on to become. You did it in the dark on faith with no promise of ever finding out whether it mattered. And here in one letter from one man who'd bothered to find out her name was the answer she'd never expected to receive. It had mattered. More than she could have imagined. It had mattered in ways that would keep mattering long after she was gone. She cried then, alone quietly the way she did everything. Not from sadness, from the almost unbearable relief of knowing just this once that the thing she'd given her whole life to had been worth giving. The years went on. Emily Carter served her full career and then some. She trained a generation of shooters who came after her, and the ones with any sense listened when the quiet chief with the impossible record spoke, because word of the ridge followed her the way a good reputation eventually catches up to the people who never chased it. She never bragged. She never told the story herself. But she taught, and the ones she taught became teachers themselves. And somewhere in the DNA of a whole lineage of snipers was a woman who'd learned to stand alone and had in the end taught dozens of others that they didn't have to. And when she finally retired, when the day came to hang it all up, there was a small ceremony, the kind the military does for people who've served long and well. Emily hadn't wanted a fuss. She'd asked, in fact, that it be kept quiet. Just the paperwork, she'd said. Just let me go home. But when she walked into that room on her last day, she stopped in the doorway. Because they were all there. Hayes Gray, now retired years before, standing straight as ever. Cortez, a career man himself now, with more rank on his collar than anyone would have guessed from the scared kid on the mountain. Doyle, heavier and grayer and grinning like a fool. And Reynolds at the front of them, a senior man now decorated, respected, a leader of Marines in his own right. Everything he'd once pretended to be and hadn't been until the day a woman he doubted showed him what the real thing looked like. They'd come from all over the country. Some of them had traveled 2 days to be there. For a woman, most of them hadn't served alongside in decades. For 11 days once a lifetime ago in the Mojave. Emily stood in the doorway and could not speak. "We heard you were trying to sneak off, quiet chief," Reynolds said, and his voice was thick and his eyes were already wet. "We couldn't let you do that. Not this time." He stepped forward. "You spent your whole life doing the right thing in the dark where nobody could see it. And that's fine. That's who you are. But you don't get to walk out of this one alone. Not while any of us are still breathing. We wouldn't be who we are without you. Not one of us. So we came to say it out loud, where you'd have to hear it." He straightened, and once more, the way he had on that desert morning so many years ago, he saluted her. And once more, every man in that room came to attention and saluted the woman they'd walked up a mountain doubting. Emily Carter looked at them. Old men now, most of them the desert, long behind them, their careers winding down, or already done, gathered here for no reason on earth, except that she had once refused to look away, and they had once chosen to stand with her, and none of them had ever forgotten what that choice had made them. She came to attention, her hand was not quite steady, and she returned the salute one final time. "I spent a long time believing I'd go through this whole life alone," she said when she could trust her voice. "That the price of being who I am was that I'd never really belong anywhere. And I made my peace with that a long time ago. I decided the work was enough, that doing right was enough even if I had to do it by myself in the dark forever." She looked at the faces in front of her one by one, the way she had on that ridge, the way she always did. "And then 11 days in a desert taught me I was wrong. You taught me I was wrong. You showed me that the loneliest people are sometimes just the ones who never got to find out what standing next to somebody feels like. And you gave me that. All of you. You gave me the thing I'd stopped believing I was allowed to have." Her voice broke and she let it. "I don't have the words. I've never been good with words. That was always the whole reason I let the rifle talk. But I'll say this, and I mean it more than I've ever meant anything. Thank you. For the ridge, for the truth, for standing with me when it could have cost you everything, and for driving all this way all these years later to make sure an old woman didn't get to leave thinking she'd done it all alone. She lowered her hand. I didn't. I know that now, and I'll carry it home with me. The good part. Always the good part. You. Nobody moved for a moment. And then Cortez, no longer a frightened kid, but a seasoned Marine with gray at his temples, said quietly, "You know what you told me on that mountain, Chief, when I asked how you got so good? I remember. You said you got that good because for a long time it was the only thing you had. And I've thought about that for 30 years. He shook his head slowly. But you were wrong about one thing. It wasn't the only thing you had. You just didn't know yet that the rest of us were coming." And Emily Carter, who had taught herself so long ago never to let anyone see her cry, stood in that room full of the men who'd become her brothers and wept openly and was not ashamed of it, and for once in her long and solitary life did not feel alone at all. The story doesn't have a dramatic ending after that. Real ones rarely do. Emily retired to a quiet place, the kind of small and unremarkable life she'd always wanted. The job finally done, the weight finally set down. She kept her box of letters. She added the ones that kept coming because they never stopped coming, not until the men who wrote them began one by one to pass on the way old soldiers do. She outlived most of them. That's the cruel arithmetic of being the strong one. You're often the last to leave, but she was never forgotten, not for a single day. Because somewhere out there right now, there is a shooter taking a shot they learned from someone who learned it from someone who learned it from Emily Carter. There is a young person being told they're worth more than their doubters believe in, words that trace all the way back to a ridge in the Mojave. There are two people on the far side of the world who lived full lives and raised children of their own and never knew they owed all of it to a woman they never met. And there is a lesson passed hand to hand across generations, quiet and true, and impossible to kill, that says the same thing it is always said. You cannot tell a warrior by their size or their voice or their gender or the certainty of the people who write them off. You can only tell a warrior by what they do in the one moment when everything falls apart and nobody would blame them for failing. And in that moment, and every moment after it, Emily Carter answered the only question the battlefield ever asks, the only question that has ever mattered. When the pressure came, she did what needed to be done. She always did. And that is why long after the desert wind erased every footprint she ever left in the Mojave, the men who once laughed at her were still standing at attention, still saluting, still telling anyone who would listen about the woman they didn't believe in until the day they died. Because some people spend their whole lives demanding respect and never earn a drop of it. And some people never ask for it once and earn so much that it outlives them by 100 years. Emily Carter was the second kind. She always was.